The day William Carter realized power meant nothing, it was already too late to undo what he had done 10 years ago, and that single truth would come back to him inside a glass tower overlooking Manhattan. In the heart of New York City, where money decides who gets to stay and who gets erased, William Carter was once untouchable, a white billionaire real estate mogul who believed every decision he made was justified by numbers on a spreadsheet. 10 years earlier, on a cold night that no one in his world ever bothered to remember, he approved an eviction notice that forced a struggling black family out of their home, not with cruelty in his voice, but with the calm detachment of someone who thought he was simply maintaining business standards. What he never saw again was the woman standing outside the building afterward, Ava Johnson, holding her younger siblings close while staring at the locked doors of a life that had just been taken from her. Today, Ava is no longer the powerless figure he once dismissed as collateral damage. She is a composed, intelligent black woman in her early 30s, standing at the center of a high-level corporate conference room in Midtown Manhattan, holding a black folder that no one in the room dares to question. The air is still when William enters, his presence still commanding attention, but something in the room shifts the moment his eyes land on her, because he does not recognize her at first, only feels an unfamiliar pressure in his chest that he cannot explain. Ava does not move, does not smile, does not introduce herself immediately. She simply waits, allowing silence to stretch until it becomes uncomfortable enough to force memory to rise. William attempts polite professionalism, asking who she is and why she has been granted access to a meeting of this level, but the moment she finally speaks his name, the tone in her voice fractures something buried deep in him. "You don't remember me, do you, Mr. Carter?" she says calmly, and suddenly the polished walls of the room feel smaller, as if the past has physically entered with her. A flicker of recognition begins to form in his mind, not complete, not yet, but enough to disturb his composure as he studies her face more carefully, searching through years he thought had no consequences. Ava finally places the folder on the table, not aggressively, but with deliberate control, and inside it is a single document that once carried no meaning to him but now feels like a sealed accusation waiting to be opened. Around them, executives exchange uneasy glances, sensing that this is no ordinary business discussion, while William's confidence begins to fracture in small, invisible ways, like glass under pressure. Ava leans slightly forward and says nothing more than the truth he never prepared for, that their past is not buried, not forgotten, and not separate from the deal he came here to finalize today. In that moment, the power dynamic in the room begins to shift without anyone raising their voice, because for the first time in decades, William Carter is not the one controlling the outcome, he is the one being measured. And as Ava watches him struggle to place her, she knows the exact second he will remember everything, and when he does, nothing in his world will ever return to what he called normal. The silence in the room deepened as William Carter tried to steady his breathing, forcing himself to maintain the composure that had defined his entire life in business, but something about the woman standing across from him refused to fit inside the version of reality he had built. Ava Johnson remained still, her posture calm and deliberate, her eyes never wandering, as if she had already lived through every possible reaction he could give and was no longer impressed by any of them. William slowly adjusted his tie, attempting to reclaim authority through familiar gestures, and asked again in a controlled voice who she was and what business she had with his company at this level, but this time Ava did not answer immediately. Instead, she studied him in a way that felt less like observation and more like measurement, as though she was comparing the man in front of her to a memory that no longer needed validation. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but precise, and she said she had waited 10 years for him to ask that question in person, because for 10 years she had asked it in silence herself. The words landed heavily, and something in William's expression tightened as his mind began searching through fragments he had buried beneath years of distance and distraction. He saw flashes he could not fully control, a cold evening in New York, a clipboard in his hand, a brief exchange of instructions he once considered routine, and then the image of a family standing outside a building under dim streetlights, their presence briefly registered but never emotionally processed. Ava noticed the shift in his eyes immediately, the faint recognition beginning to surface like something rising from deep water, and she took a single step closer to the table, placing both hands on the polished surface as if anchoring the past into the present. She reminded him quietly that he once believed decisions made from a high floor had no echo on the ground, and that people without financial protection were simply numbers that moved on after disruption. William opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out at first, because the certainty he had relied on for decades suddenly felt unstable, as if the foundation of his judgment was being questioned in real time by someone who had lived through its consequences. Around them, the executives in the room shifted uncomfortably, sensing that this was no longer a corporate discussion but something far more personal, though none of them dared to interrupt. Ava finally opened the black folder she had brought, sliding a single document forward across the table with controlled precision, and told him that she was not here by accident or coincidence, and that her presence in this room had been approved long before he ever received the invitation. William looked down at the document, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the contents, and for the first time a subtle change appeared in his expression, not anger, not denial, but the unsettling realization that the past he had minimized might have been documented far more carefully than he ever expected. His mind pushed further back, and now the memory of that night returned more clearly, not as an abstract decision but as a sequence of human moments he had once chosen not to feel, including a brief hesitation he now could not explain why he ignored. Ava's voice softened slightly but did not lose its firmness as she told him that consequences do not disappear just because time passes, they simply wait for the right moment to be understood. William finally looked up from the document and met her eyes directly, and in that instant the remaining distance between memory and truth collapsed completely, because he now recognized her not as a stranger, but as the girl who once stood outside his decision without a voice he had bothered to hear. The realization did not bring clarity, only weight, and as the room seemed to grow quieter around them, Ava asked him one final question that made the entire atmosphere shift again, asking if he remembered what it felt like to have no one listen, because very soon he was going to experience it in a way he would never forget. William Carter stood frozen for a moment longer than he intended, his eyes still locked on the document Ava Johnson had placed in front of him, as if staring long enough could rewrite what it contained, but the reality remained unchanged and quietly absolute. The conference room in Midtown Manhattan felt tighter now, not because the space had changed, but because the air between two people who once shared a forgotten history had become heavy with everything neither of them had said for 10 years. Ava remained composed, her posture steady, her expression calm in a way that made it clear she was no longer the girl left outside in the cold, but someone who had learned to survive in silence and return with precision. William finally lowered himself into the chair opposite her, not as a gesture of control, but as if his body had decided before his mind that standing no longer made sense in a moment like this. He asked quietly, almost cautiously, what she wanted from him, and for the first time in years, the confidence in his voice was no longer automatic but carefully constructed. Ava did not answer immediately, instead she looked down at the table as if recalling something far away, and when she spoke, her words carried the weight of a memory she had carried alone for too long. She reminded him of a night that once meant nothing to him but had defined everything for her, a night when her family was given minutes to leave a place they thought they belonged to, not because they had failed as people, but because they had failed to meet a number on a system he controlled. William's jaw tightened, and he tried to respond with explanation, the way powerful people often do when confronted with consequences they never anticipated, but Ava raised her hand slightly, not in anger, but in finality, and told him she was no longer here to listen to versions of events that softened reality. She then slid another page from the folder, this one containing records, approvals, and signatures that traced the decision back further than William remembered, revealing that what he once believed was routine had been influenced by internal pressure and hidden agendas inside his own organization. The realization did not come as a sudden shock but as a slow collapse of certainty, like a structure he had trusted for years quietly revealing cracks he had chosen not to see. Around them, the executives remained silent, their discomfort growing as they understood that what was unfolding was no longer a private conversation but a correction of something long buried within corporate history. William looked at the document again, this time not searching for denial but for context, and what he found instead was his own signature, detached from the emotional consequences that Ava had lived through in full. His voice lowered as he asked if this was the reason she had returned, but Ava shook her head gently, saying her return was not about revenge or closure in the way people usually imagine, but about truth being placed exactly where it had been missing. She explained that over the years she had built a life not defined by what was taken from her, but by what she chose to rebuild, studying law, working in financial reform, and eventually entering the very system that once excluded her family without hesitation. William listened in silence as the story unfolded, realizing that the woman sitting across from him had not spent 10 Years waiting in anger, but in transformation. For the first time, he saw not a victim of his past decisions, but a reflection of consequences evolving into something he could no longer categorize or dismiss. Ava finally leaned back slightly, her voice steady but unmistakably firm as she told him that today was not about destruction of his name or empire, but about forcing him to look directly at what his decisions created when no one was there to question them. And as the weight of that statement settled into the room, William Carter understood that what came next would not be measured in profit or loss, but in whether a man who once believed he was untouchable could now face the truth without turning away. William Carter remained seated as the silence in the conference room deepened into something heavier than words, and for the first time in years he felt as if the walls that once protected his authority were no longer aligned with his side of the room. Ava Johnson watched him carefully, not with satisfaction, but with the calm focus of someone who had already carried this moment long before it ever arrived. The executives around them remained still, their attention divided between the documents on the table and the subtle collapse of confidence happening inside a man they once considered untouchable. William finally spoke again, his voice lower than before, asking what exactly she believed she had uncovered, and whether she understood the scale of the consequences she was implying. Ava did not react to his attempt to regain control through language. Instead, she opened the folder fully and revealed a structured timeline of internal communications, approvals, and revised housing policies that extended far beyond a single eviction event. She explained, with precise clarity, that the decision affecting her family had been part of a larger restructuring initiative driven by cost optimization metrics that prioritized occupancy efficiency over human stability, a system he had approved without reviewing the individual case-level implications. William leaned forward slightly as he read, his eye scanning line after line, and each sentence seemed to strip away another layer of certainty he had relied on for years. He had always believed that delegation protected him from direct responsibility, that distance from execution meant distance from consequence, but Ava's documentation showed a chain of decisions that connected directly back to his authorization signature. For a moment he tried to speak, attempting to separate intent from outcome, but Ava interrupted gently, telling him that intent had never been the issue because impact does not wait for permission to become real. The room remained silent except for the faint sound of paper shifting as she turned another page, revealing a secondary internal review that had flagged the eviction wave as disproportionately affecting vulnerable tenants, a report that had been acknowledged but not escalated. William's expression tightened as he realized that the system he built did not fail in one moment, but functioned exactly as designed, and that realization carried more weight than any financial loss he had ever experienced. Ava then shifted the conversation slightly, explaining that after the eviction her family had been scattered across temporary housing arrangements, and that while she eventually rebuilt her life through education and discipline, not everyone in her family had the same path or outcome, a detail she delivered without emotional escalation, only factual clarity. William lowered his gaze for a moment, no longer studying the documents but confronting the gap between what he thought he had managed and what had actually unfolded outside his awareness. He asked quietly why she had chosen to return now, after so many years, and Ava paused before answering, not because she lacked certainty, but because she wanted him to understand the answer fully. She explained that she had spent years working within legal and financial reform systems, studying how large institutions distribute accountability, and eventually realized that change required not only reform from outside but confrontation from within the spaces where decisions were originally made. This meeting, she told him, was not spontaneous and not emotional, but the result of years of structured preparation, including verified audits, legal review, and board-level authorization that granted her access to this very room under partnership terms that could not be revoked without mutual consent. William's eyes lifted sharply at that detail, and for the first time the situation was no longer only about memory or morality, but about governance and authority he could no longer unilaterally override. One of the executives finally spoke cautiously, asking for clarification about the partnership she referenced, and Ava confirmed that her organization now held strategic influence within one of William's key development divisions, meaning any major decision moving forward would require her approval. The weight of that statement settled across the room like a structural shift no one had anticipated, and William understood that what stood in front of him was no longer just a person from his past, but a force embedded within his present operations. Ava closed the folder slowly and looked directly at him, her voice steady as she told him that she did not come to destroy what he built, but to ensure that what was built could no longer ignore the lives it affected. And in that moment William realized that the most dangerous part of her return was not the exposure of what he had done, but the fact that she now had the power to define what came next, and he had no control over whether that definition would include him at all. William Carter remained seated longer than anyone expected, not because he was trying to maintain authority, but because for the first time in his professional life he was unsure what authority even meant in a room where the rules had quietly changed without his approval. Ava Johnson stood across from him with a calmness that did not feel emotional or reactive, but instead felt structured, as if every word she spoke had already been tested against time before she ever entered this building. The executives around the table now avoided eye contact with both of them, sensing that what was unfolding was no longer a discussion of past grievances but a shift in operational control that extended far beyond personal history. William finally broke the silence by asking what exactly she meant when she said she had influence within his development division, and for the first time there was a noticeable hesitation in his tone, not fear, but uncertainty shaped by unfamiliar dependency. Ava did not respond immediately. Instead she placed her hands lightly on the edge of the table, anchoring herself in the present moment, and explained that over the past several years she had been part of an independent advisory consortium focused on urban housing reform, a body that had recently entered a strategic partnership with his corporation under regulatory approval and shareholder consent. As she spoke, William realized that this was not an informal arrangement or symbolic inclusion, but a formal integration that affected approval chains, project funding validation, and long-term development planning. He asked quietly whether this meant she had authority over ongoing projects, and Ava clarified that she did not control the company, but she did hold binding review rights on initiatives related to housing displacement and community redevelopment. The words landed in the room with a weight that could not be softened by corporate language, because it meant decisions he once made in isolation would now be examined through a lens he could not bypass. William leaned back slightly, his mind processing the implication that the system he once navigated freely now included a checkpoint he did not design, and that checkpoint was sitting directly across from him. Ava then shifted the focus away from structure and toward consequence, telling him that her goal was never to interfere with his business success, but to ensure that success no longer came at the cost of unseen displacement or unaccounted disruption. She explained that after the eviction event from 10 years earlier, she did not pursue revenge or public confrontation, but instead dedicated herself to studying financial systems, housing policy, and corporate governance in order to understand how decisions like his could be made without emotional awareness of impact. William listened without interruption, and for the first time he did not respond with defense or justification, because he was beginning to understand that every explanation he once relied on now sounded incomplete even to himself. Ava continued, revealing that her work eventually connected her with reform initiatives supported by both legal institutions and private investment groups seeking to prevent repeat cycles of mass displacement in urban centers like New York City. One of those initiatives had specifically reviewed historical development decisions made by his company, which led to a formal recommendation for structural partnership rather than external opposition, a recommendation that had been approved after extensive evaluation. William asked softly what that meant for him personally, and Ava paused for a moment before answering, not with threat, but with clarity, telling him that it meant accountability would no longer be abstract or delayed, but present in every major decision involving communities affected by his organization. Around them, the room felt different now, as if the conference table had become a boundary between two versions of power, one built on control and the other built on oversight. William finally admitted, almost to himself more than to her, that he had never considered that a single decision made years ago could evolve into something that would return with structure and legal permanence. Ava met his gaze and told him that this was not a return of the past, but the continuation of consequences that had always existed, only now they had a voice inside the system that once ignored them. As the weight of her words settled, William understood that the real shift was not that she had come back into his life, but that she had entered the framework of his future, and from this point forward, nothing he built would move without passing through the memory he once tried to forget. William Carter remained still long after Ava Johnson finished speaking, his hands resting on the polished conference table as if physical contact with the surface could somehow stabilize the reality that was slowly restructuring itself around him. The room in Midtown Manhattan no longer felt like a space he controlled, but like a shared environment where every word spoken carried equal weight, regardless of status, title, or financial authority. Ava stood across from him with a composed stillness that was not passive, but intentional, as though she had already anticipated every possible reaction he might attempt and had prepared beyond all of them. William finally exhaled and asked in a quieter tone what her actual objective was inside his organization, because despite everything he had heard, his mind still searched for a familiar logic that could categorize her presence as either threat, negotiation, or coincidence. Ava did not answer immediately, and instead allowed the silence to settle in a way that made it clear she was no longer operating within his timeline of expectation. When she finally spoke, she explained that her role inside the partnership was not symbolic and not temporary, but part of a structured oversight framework that had been designed to evaluate long-term housing impact decisions across multiple development projects in New York City. William listened carefully as she clarified that this framework did not override leadership, but required transparency, documentation review, and ethical validation before major residential displacement or redevelopment actions could proceed. For the first time, William began to understand that what he was facing was not an individual confrontation, but an institutional shift that had been built around principles he had never been required to answer to in this way before. He asked if this meant she had the authority to block his future projects, and Ava responded calmly that she did not hold unilateral power, but she did hold review rights that could delay, modify, or escalate decisions to regulatory partners if necessary standards were not met. The answer was not delivered with hostility, but with clarity, and that clarity made it more difficult for William to dismiss. Around them, the executives remained silent, no longer speaking or reacting, because they understood that any interruption would only expose further instability in a situation that was already beyond their usual corporate hierarchy. William leaned back slightly and looked at the ceiling for a brief moment, as if searching for a version of the system he used to trust, but found none that matched what was now in front of him. Ava then shifted the conversation by stating that her involvement was not designed to disrupt progress, but to ensure that progress could no longer be separated from accountability, especially in areas where housing displacement had historically been treated as an operational side effect rather than a human consequence. She explained that after leaving the environment of that eviction years ago, she committed herself to studying policy structures, financial modeling, and urban development systems that allowed large-scale decisions to be made without direct visibility of their human impact. William listened without interruption, and for the first time there was no instinctive rebuttal forming in his response, only reflection that felt uncomfortable because it no longer supported his previous assumptions. Ava continued by stating that the partnership was approved through formal channels that included shareholder review and compliance oversight, meaning her presence was not personal and could not be dismissed as emotional grievance or isolated dispute. William finally asked, almost in a lower voice than before, what would happen if he chose to resist or ignore the framework she represented, and Ava answered without hesitation that the system did not require his agreement to function, only his participation if he chose to continue operating within it. That statement changed the atmosphere in the room again, because it made clear that resistance was not a confrontation between two individuals, but a structural decision with consequences that would extend beyond this meeting. Ava then softened her tone slightly and told him that she was not there to erase what he had built, but to ensure that what he built could evolve without repeating the conditions that once displaced families like hers. William looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time he saw not a former victim or an opposing force, but a person who had moved through consequence and returned with systems he could not bypass or simplify. And in that realization, he understood that the most important shift was not her presence inside his company, but the fact that every decision he made from this point forward would now exist in a space where the past was no longer absent, and silence was no longer protection. The atmosphere inside the conference room had shifted into something neither side could ignore, as William Carter remained seated with his hands now loosely folded in front of him, no longer projecting authority but instead attempting to process a reality that refused to align with the framework he had relied on for decades. Ava Johnson stood across from him, still composed, still controlled, but no longer explaining her position as if she needed validation, because by this point the structure of her presence had already replaced the need for persuasion. The executives in the room remained unusually quiet, their earlier uncertainty now replaced by cautious attention, as they understood that what was unfolding was no longer a private dispute but a redefinition of how influence operated inside the organization. William finally spoke again, asking in a measured tone what the next step would be if this framework continued, not as resistance, but but as an attempt to understand the boundaries of a system that had suddenly become more complex than anything he had previously managed. Ava took a moment before responding, and when she did, her voice carried the calm precision of someone who had already mapped every possible outcome. She explained that the next phase would involve structured integration of oversight protocols into active development projects, beginning with a comprehensive review of ongoing housing initiatives in multiple districts across New York City, ensuring that every major decision could be evaluated not only for financial viability but also for social impact consistency. William listened carefully, realizing that this meant the company was entering a phase where decision-making was no longer unilateral, but distributed across a framework that included accountability checkpoints he did not control. He asked if this would slow down operations, and Ava responded honestly that it would introduce additional layers of review, but that those layers were designed to prevent long-term systemic consequences rather than obstruct progress. There was no hostility in her tone, only structure, and that structure made the conversation more difficult for William to dismiss or reinterpret. For a brief moment, he looked around the table at his executive team, noticing that none of them were willing to offer reassurance, because they too understood that the environment they had operated in was being redefined in real time. Ava then shifted slightly in her stance and introduced a second component of the framework, explaining that community-level reporting mechanisms would now be integrated into project evaluation cycles, allowing affected residents to provide documented feedback that would be formally reviewed alongside financial projections. William's expression tightened subtly at this, not out of disagreement, but out of recognition that this introduced a form of visibility he had never fully accounted for in his earlier models of development efficiency. Ava continued, stating that her role within this structure was not to interfere with leadership decisions, but to ensure that no decision involving displacement or large-scale redevelopment could proceed without acknowledgement of its human impact data. As she spoke, William found himself recalling earlier years of his career when decisions were made quickly, efficiently, and often without extended review of long-term consequences, and for the first time he began to question whether that efficiency had come at a cost that had simply been deferred rather than avoided. He looked at Ava again, this time not as someone from his past, but as someone who had constructed a parallel system of accountability that now intersected directly with his current operations. He asked quietly whether she believed this approach would fundamentally change how large-scale development functioned in cities like New York, and Ava answered without hesitation that change was already happening, and that the only question remaining was whether institutions would adapt proactively or be forced to adapt through external correction. The weight of that statement lingered in the room, because it reframed the entire situation not as a confrontation between two individuals, but as part of a broader shift in how power structures were being re-evaluated. William leaned back slightly, his gaze lowering toward the table, and for a brief moment he stopped thinking about strategy or response, and instead considered the possibility that everything he had built might now exist within a system that no longer required his approval to define its limits. Ava finally concluded by stating that she did not expect immediate agreement, only acknowledgement that the era of isolated decision-making had already ended within his organization, whether he was ready for it or not. And in that moment, William Carter understood that the true turning point was not her return, but the irreversible fact that the future of his company would now be shaped in a space where the past could no longer be ignored. The silence inside the conference room had shifted into something heavier than strategy or negotiation, as William Carter now sat in a state of controlled stillness, his eyes occasionally moving between Ava Johnson and the documents that had permanently altered the structure of his understanding. Ava remained standing, but no longer in opposition, instead positioned like an integrated force within the same system she was now describing, her presence no longer external to his world but embedded inside it. William finally spoke again, asking in a calm but noticeably restrained tone what immediate changes he should expect within the next operational cycle, and whether her framework would begin affecting active development decisions within weeks or months. Ava did not rush her response, as if she was measuring not only the question but the intention behind it, and when she finally answered, she explained that the implementation would begin gradually, starting with high-value housing projects already under review, followed by phased integration into regional expansion plans over the next fiscal year. She clarified that this was not an abrupt restructuring, but a controlled transition designed to allow both leadership and operational teams to adapt without destabilizing existing commitments. William nodded slowly, not out of agreement, but out of recognition that the language she used was not theoretical, but already operational within the system he had built. One of the senior executives finally gathered the confidence to ask whether this meant external reporting obligations would also increase, and Ava confirmed that transparency requirements would extend to both internal governance and certain regulatory bodies, ensuring that displacement risk assessments and community impact evaluations would be documented and reviewed before final approvals were granted. The room became quieter after that confirmation because it reframed the entire corporate structure not as a purely profit-driven system, but as one that now required continuous ethical validation as part of its operational identity. William leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, and for the first time he appeared less like a man defending authority and more like someone attempting to understand the boundaries of a system that had evolved beyond his original design. He asked Ava directly whether she believed this level of oversight would slow down innovation, and she responded with careful precision that innovation would not be reduced, but redefined, because progress that ignored long-term human impact was no longer considered sustainable within the updated framework. As she spoke, William found himself thinking not only about the current moment, but about years of decisions made under assumptions of efficiency, assumptions that now felt incomplete when viewed through the structure she had introduced. Ava then shifted the conversation slightly, explaining that part of the integration process included retrospective review of past projects, not for punishment, but for calibration of future standards, ensuring that patterns of displacement or unintended harm could be identified and prevented earlier in future developments. William asked quietly how far back those reviews would extend, and Ava answered that they would begin with a defined 10-year scope, which caused a subtle pause in the room, because it aligned directly with the timeline of the eviction event that had brought her into his life in the first place. For a moment, William did not respond, and instead looked down at the table, as if the surface itself contained answers he had never previously needed to examine. Ava continued in a steady voice, clarifying that this was not about reopening emotional history, but about understanding structural outcomes, because systems could only improve when they were willing to observe their own past without avoidance. One of the executives asked whether this retrospective process could expose internal liability, and Ava responded that the objective was not legal exposure but systemic correction, though she acknowledged that accountability and transparency were inseparable from meaningful reform. William finally exhaled slowly, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different tone, no longer fully resistant but no longer fully comfortable either, as he admitted that he had always believed large-scale systems were too complex to connect directly to individual outcomes in a meaningful way. Ava met his gaze and told him that complexity was never the problem, but distance was, because distance allowed decisions to feel abstract even when their consequences were deeply personal to others. The room remained still as that statement settled, and William understood that the real shift had nothing to do with authority, control, or even business structure, but with perception, because once consequences were no longer distant, every decision would carry a weight that could not be delegated away. And in that realization, he recognized that the version of leadership he had practiced for decades was no longer the only version that existed, and possibly not the one that would define what came next. The conference room in Midtown Manhattan had settled into a stillness that no longer felt temporary, as if the space itself had accepted that something irreversible had already been introduced into its structure. William Carter remained seated, his posture controlled but no longer rigid, as his attention alternated between Ava Johnson and the layered reality that now surrounded every decision he had ever made. Ava stood in the same position, composed and steady, her presence no longer functioning as an interruption to his world but as a permanent reference point inside it. William finally spoke again, his voice measured but noticeably quieter than before, asking what the immediate impact of the retrospective review process would be on his active portfolio, and whether any projects currently under construction would be affected before completion. Ava did not respond immediately, allowing the question to settle fully before addressing it, and when she did, her explanation was precise and structured, stating that ongoing projects would not be halted without cause, but would be evaluated against updated compliance standards as each phase reached predefined milestones. She clarified that this approach was designed to prevent disruption while still ensuring that long-term impact assessment remained continuous rather than reactive. William nodded slightly, absorbing the implication that nothing moving forward would exist outside of review, even if it had already been approved under previous systems. One of the executives cautiously asked whether investor confidence might be affected by this new layer of evaluation, and Ava responded that transparency typically strengthened long-term stability, even if it required short-term adjustment, because predictable accountability reduced systemic risk over time. The answer did not eliminate concern in the room, but it redefined it, shifting the focus from immediate control to long-term adaptation. William leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table again, and asked if there was any scenario in which a project could proceed without passing through her review structure, attempting to understand whether exceptions still existed within this new framework. Ava met his gaze directly and explained that exceptions were not eliminated, but they were no longer unilateral, meaning that any deviation from standard evaluation would require documented justification and independent verification before approval could be granted. For a brief moment, William said nothing, and in that silence, it became clear that what had changed was not only procedure, but expectation, because speed was no longer the sole measure of efficiency inside his organization. Ava then shifted the conversation slightly, stating that one of the key objectives of the integration was to align development outcomes with long-term demographic stability in urban areas, particularly in neighborhoods that had historically experienced displacement cycles linked to rapid redevelopment. She explained that this alignment was not based on sentiment, but on longitudinal data showing that communities disrupted without structured transition planning often experienced generational instability that eventually impacted broader economic ecosystems. William listened carefully, and although he did not interrupt, it was evident that he was processing the idea that outcomes he once considered external consequences were now being defined as internal system variables. He finally asked whether she believed his company had contributed significantly to those patterns in the past, and Ava paused before answering, choosing her words carefully, stating that the system had produced outcomes consistent with its design priorities at the time, and that responsibility now lay in whether those priorities would evolve or remain unchanged. The phrasing was deliberate, neither accusatory nor absolving, but it removed the comfort of ambiguity that William had relied on for years. Around them, the executives remained silent, understanding that this was no longer a negotiation between individuals but a recalibration of institutional philosophy. William looked down at his hands briefly, as if examining them through a different perspective than he ever had before, and when he spoke again, his question carried less resistance and more uncertainty, asking what she believed leadership should look like under this new structure. Ava answered without hesitation, stating that leadership would no longer be defined solely by decision-making authority, but by the ability to anticipate impact, incorporate accountability, and adapt to information that previously existed outside traditional executive visibility. She added that leadership in this context required accepting that authority and oversight were no longer separate domains, but interconnected responsibilities within the same system. William slowly leaned back again, and for the first time since the beginning of the meeting, he did not attempt to reassert control or reframe the situation in terms familiar to him, because he was beginning to understand that familiarity no longer determined relevance. Ava finally concluded by stating that the purpose of her involvement was not to diminish his role, but to expand the framework within which that role operated, ensuring that decisions affecting thousands of lives could no longer exist in isolation from their consequences. And as those words settled across the room, William Carter realized that the world he had mastered was not disappearing, but being rewritten in real time inside the very space where he once believed he alone defined the rules. The tension inside the Midtown Manhattan conference room had evolved into a steady, controlled silence, as if every person present had unconsciously accepted that the conversation was no longer about negotiation but about structural truth being laid bare in real time. William Carter remained seated, his hands now resting flat on the table, no longer seeking dominance through posture, but instead attempting to remain grounded in a reality that no longer responded to his usual methods of control. Ava Johnson stood across from him with unwavering composure, her presence no longer functioning as opposition, but as a fixed point around which the entire discussion had begun to reorganize itself. William finally spoke again, his voice lower and more deliberate than before, asking what the immediate consequences of the retrospective accountability framework would be if past projects were flagged for compliance inconsistencies, and whether such findings could lead to operational interruptions or structural revisions. Ava did not respond immediately, allowing the question to settle fully into the room before addressing it, and when she did, her answer was calm and methodical, explaining that the purpose of retrospective review was not disruption, but correction, and that any identified inconsistencies would follow. A tiered evaluation process designed to distinguish between procedural variance and systemic risk. She clarified that only findings with verified long-term impact implications would escalate beyond internal review, while the majority of historical assessments would result in updated guidelines rather than operational shutdowns. William listened carefully, realizing that what she was describing was not a punitive mechanism, but an adaptive feedback system that treated past decisions as data rather than irreversible verdicts. One of the senior executives cautiously asked whether this meant previous leadership decisions could now be reinterpreted under current standards, and Ava responded with precision, stating that the framework did not exist to rewrite history, but to ensure that historical outcomes informed future decision thresholds. The distinction was subtle but significant, and it shifted the atmosphere again, reducing some of the immediate tension while increasing the weight of long-term implication. William leaned back slightly, his gaze briefly drifting toward the glass wall overlooking the Manhattan skyline, as if searching for perspective outside the confined logic of the room, before returning his attention to Ava and asking in a quieter tone whether this framework was intended to permanently change the company's identity or simply refine its operational ethics. Ava paused for a moment before answering, not because she was uncertain, but because the answer required careful framing to avoid misunderstanding. She explained that identity was not being replaced, but expanded, because organizations operating at scale inevitably evolve when exposed to sustained accountability structures, and that evolution was not optional in environments where external stakeholders, regulatory systems, and impacted communities were increasingly interconnected. William absorbed this in silence, and for the first time since the beginning of the meeting, he did not immediately seek to reinterpret her words through a lens of risk or control, but instead considered them as part of a larger systemic shift that he could no longer position himself outside of. Ava continued by stating that the retrospective framework would initially focus on a defined portfolio of urban redevelopment projects, with particular attention to housing transitions, tenant displacement metrics, and approval chain transparency over the past decade, ensuring that patterns could be identified and addressed at the structural level. William asked slowly whether he would be required to personally justify past decisions during this process, and Ava responded that individual review would only occur where direct authorization responsibility was clearly documented, but that the broader objective was institutional learning rather than personal adjudication. The clarification created a noticeable shift in William's expression, as he began to recognize that while he was still central to the system, he was no longer the sole point of interpretation for its outcomes. Around the table, the executives remained silent, aware that the framework being described would redefine reporting structures, approval hierarchies, and long-established operational assumptions they had relied on for years. William finally spoke again, asking in a more reflective tone what she believed the organization would look like 5 years from now under this model, and Ava answered with steady confidence that the company would likely become slower in isolated decision-making, but significantly stronger in long-term resilience, because transparency and accountability would reduce the likelihood of compounding systemic errors. The answer lingered in the air, and for a moment William did not respond, because he understood that what she was describing was not a limitation, but a transformation of how scale itself functioned. He looked at her again, not as a figure from his past or a regulator of his present, but as someone who had fundamentally altered the boundaries of his future decision-making space. And in that realization, William Carter understood that the most significant change was no longer external pressure or internal resistance, but the fact that every choice he would make from this moment forward would exist in a system where consequence was no longer distant, delayed, or invisible, but continuously present and structurally acknowledged. William Carter remained seated in the conference room, but the stillness in his posture no longer reflected control, rather it reflected a mind processing a shift that could not be reversed or ignored. The skyline of Manhattan outside the glass walls remained unchanged, yet inside the room every assumption he had carried for decades felt as if it was being quietly redefined in real time. Ava Johnson stood across from him, no longer presenting new arguments, but instead allowing the structure she had introduced to settle fully into the space between them, as if the system itself now spoke through her presence. William finally broke the silence with a slower, more restrained tone, asking what the personal implications of this framework would be for him moving forward, not in terms of authority, but in terms of responsibility under the new oversight structure. Ava did not respond immediately, and when she did, her answer was carefully measured, stating that personal implications would depend entirely on the scope of decision-making involvement in projects flagged for retrospective evaluation, but emphasized that the framework was designed to focus on institutional outcomes rather than individual punishment. William nodded slightly, but his expression suggested that he was still separating theory from lived consequence, trying to understand where he now stood within a system he once fully controlled. One of the executives cautiously asked whether this meant leadership roles would now be subject to external validation before final execution of strategic decisions, and Ava confirmed that for defined categories of high-impact developments, review and validation would be required prior to implementation, ensuring alignment with updated compliance and impact standards. The room remained silent after that confirmation, because it marked a fundamental change in how authority flowed through the organization, shifting from internal discretion to shared verification. William looked down briefly, then asked in a lower tone whether this framework assumed past leadership decisions were inherently flawed, and Ava responded with calm precision that the framework did not assign moral labeling to past actions, but instead evaluated outcomes in order to improve future decision accuracy. That distinction was important, yet it did not fully ease the tension in the room, because it still placed past actions under structured examination that could influence present credibility. William leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly, and for a moment he did not speak, as if recalibrating how to interpret leadership when it was no longer defined by uninterrupted authority. Ava continued by explaining that one of the key components of the system was a continuous feedback loop between operational performance and community impact data, meaning that large-scale development decisions would no longer be evaluated solely at approval stages, but throughout their entire life cycle. She clarified that this approach was designed to prevent delayed recognition of systemic issues, which historically had led to long-term consequences becoming visible only after they had already affected communities. William listened without interruption, but his silence carried a different weight now, less defensive and more contemplative, as if he was beginning to recognize that the structure she described was not external interference, but an evolved form of accountability that his own industry had never fully integrated. Ava then shifted the focus slightly, stating that retrospective review would begin with a limited scope of projects that had undergone rapid expansion cycles in the past decade, particularly those involving housing transitions in densely populated urban districts. William asked quietly whether this would include projects he personally approved, and Ava answered that inclusion was based on documented decision chains rather than individual prominence, meaning that any project meeting the criteria would be subject to review regardless of who authorized it. The executives exchanged brief glances, understanding that this eliminated informal protection layers that had historically existed around senior decision-makers. William finally looked directly at Ava and asked what outcome she expected from all of this, whether the goal was correction, prevention, or transformation of how leadership itself functioned inside the organization. Ava paused for a moment before answering, and when she did, her voice carried a steady clarity that did not require emphasis. She explained that the objective was not to dismantle leadership, but to remove the separation between leadership and consequence, ensuring that decisions affecting large populations could no longer exist without structured visibility into their long-term effects. William absorbed this without interruption, and for the first time he did not attempt to categorize her role as either challenger or partner, because the framework she represented no longer fit within those simple distinctions. Instead, he began to understand that the environment he operated in had fundamentally expanded beyond the boundaries he once believed were absolute, and that within this expanded structure, authority alone was no longer sufficient to define direction. Ava concluded by stating that the system would not require immediate agreement, only consistent participation if the organization chose to continue operating at scale under shared accountability principles. And as those words settled across the room, William Carter realized that the most significant change was not the introduction of oversight, but the irreversible truth that every future decision he made would now exist in a space where consequences were no longer distant outcomes, but active elements of the system itself. The conference room in Midtown Manhattan remained unchanged in structure, but the atmosphere had shifted into something irreversible, as if every word spoken inside it had permanently altered the meaning of the space itself. William Carter sat with his hands now resting loosely on the table, no longer attempting to assert control, but instead absorbing the full weight of a system that no longer responded to authority alone. Across from him, Ava Johnson stood with the same composed stillness she had maintained throughout the entire meeting, her presence no longer acting as opposition, but as a structural element embedded within the organization's future decision framework. William finally broke the silence, his voice steady but lower than before, asking what would happen if the company needed to make urgent strategic decisions that could not wait for full review cycles, and whether exceptions existed for time-sensitive operations. Ava did not answer immediately, allowing the question to settle fully into the room before responding, and when she did, her explanation was precise and controlled, stating that the framework did allow for expedited review pathways, but only under documented urgency conditions that required post-action validation within defined accountability windows. She clarified that urgency would no longer function as an exemption from oversight, but as a modified process with deferred verification rather than immediate bypass. William nodded slowly, realizing that even flexibility within the system now carried structure he could not unilaterally escape. One of the executives cautiously asked whether this meant decision-making speed would be significantly reduced in competitive scenarios, and Ava responded that while initial transition periods might introduce additional procedural steps, long-term stability would increase because decisions would no longer rely solely on isolated executive judgment without contextual validation. The room remained quiet after that statement, because it reframed speed not as efficiency, but as a variable that must now coexist with accountability. William leaned forward slightly, his expression now more reflective than resistant, and asked whether there was any scenario in which leadership could still act independently without triggering oversight protocols. Ava met his gaze and answered carefully that independence in leadership would still exist, but it would now function within defined boundaries of transparency, meaning that autonomy was preserved in execution but not in consequence isolation. That distinction lingered heavily in the room, because it fundamentally changed what autonomy meant in practice. William looked down briefly, then asked in a quieter tone whether this system assumed that leaders could not be trusted without external validation, and Ava responded with measured clarity that the framework was not built on distrust, but on recognition that large-scale systems required multiple layers of perspective to accurately reflect real-world impact. The answer did not dismiss leadership, but it reframed responsibility as distributed rather than concentrated. For a moment, William did not respond, and the silence that followed felt less like tension and more like internal recalibration. Ava then continued, explaining that one of the most important components of the framework was its evaluation independence, meaning that assessment mechanisms were structurally separated from profit-driven metrics, ensuring that impact analysis could not be overridden by financial urgency alone. William absorbed this without interruption, and for the first time he began to recognize that what she had introduced was not a constraint on his organization, but a parallel layer of interpretation that now existed alongside everything he had previously defined as success. He finally asked whether she believed this would ultimately change how leadership teams were formed, and Ava answered that over time leadership would likely evolve to include individuals with both operational expertise and accountability literacy, people capable of understanding not only execution but long-term consequence mapping. The executives exchanged brief glances again, realizing that this implied a gradual transformation of what qualifications mattered within the organization itself. William slowly exhaled and leaned back, his gaze drifting toward the glass wall of the conference room, where the Manhattan skyline continued unchanged, indifferent to the restructuring taking place inside. When he spoke again, his tone carried no resistance, only uncertainty mixed with recognition, as he admitted that everything she described required a level of adaptation that could not happen overnight, even for someone with his level of experience. Ava responded with a slight nod, acknowledging the challenge without diminishing it, and stated that the framework was designed for long-term integration, not immediate transformation, because systemic change required sustained alignment rather than forced compliance. William finally looked back at her directly, and in that moment, he no longer saw a disruption to his authority, but a redefinition of the environment in which authority itself operated. And as that realization settled into him, he understood that the question was no longer whether he could maintain control, but how he would function inside a system where control alone was no longer enough to define leadership. William Carter remained seated in the Midtown Manhattan conference room long after the previous exchange had settled into silence, the kind of silence that no longer felt empty but instead felt structured, as if it had become part of the new system that had been introduced into his world. Ava Johnson stood across from him, still composed, still steady, but no longer positioned as an external force of disruption, rather as an embedded authority within the operational reality he had spent decades shaping. The executives around the table remained quiet, their earlier uncertainty now replaced by cautious awareness that the conversation had reached its final structural phase, where outcomes were no longer theoretical but already in motion. William finally spoke, his voice calm but carrying a noticeable weight, asking Ava what the final state of this framework would look like once fully implemented, and whether there would ever be a point where oversight stabilized into a fixed system rather than continuous adaptation. Ava did not respond immediately, allowing the question to settle fully into the room, and when she did, her tone remained steady and precise as she explained that the system was not designed to reach a final static state, because large-scale social and economic systems do not remain stable unless they are continuously evaluated against evolving real-world conditions. She clarified that what William referred to as a final state would instead function as an ongoing equilibrium, where leadership, accountability, and impact assessment would remain in continuous alignment rather than reaching a permanent endpoint. William listened carefully, and for the first time he did not immediately seek to translate her words into operational resistance or strategic advantage, but instead considered them as structural reality. One of the executives cautiously asked whether this meant the organization would always operate under external review, and Ava responded that the review process was not external in opposition, but integrated within the system itself, designed to function as part of normal governance rather than as an exception. The distinction reframed the entire conversation once again, because it removed the idea of oversight as an intrusion and replaced it with oversight as architecture. William leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting toward the glass wall overlooking Manhattan, where the city continued its constant motion without awareness of the structural changes being negotiated inside the room. He asked in a quieter tone whether this meant his role as a leader would eventually become secondary to the framework itself, and Ava responded with measured clarity that leadership would remain essential, but its definition would shift from unilateral decision authority to coordinated responsibility within a monitored ecosystem of outcomes. The room remained silent again, not because there was confusion, but because there was recognition that the definition of leadership they had all operated under was no longer absolute. William finally turned his attention fully back to Ava and asked what she expected from him personally at this stage, whether she required agreement, compliance, or endorsement of the system she had introduced. Ava paused for a moment before answering, and when she did, her response carried a tone that was neither demanding nor uncertain, but grounded in structural necessity. She explained that what mattered was not emotional alignment or immediate agreement, but consistent participation in the framework as long as the organization continued to operate at scale, because systems of this magnitude could not function if accountability was selectively applied. William absorbed this without interruption, and for the first time there was no visible attempt to reassert control, only reflection that felt heavier than any negotiation he had ever conducted. He asked quietly whether she believed people like him could adapt to such a transformation in leadership structure, and Ava answered that adaptation was not only possible, but already occurring, because systems evolve through pressure, recognition, and sustained exposure to consequences that can no longer be deferred or ignored. The executives exchanged subtle glances again, understanding that what she described was not hypothetical but already in progress within their own organization. William looked down briefly at his hands, then spoke in a lower voice, acknowledging that everything she had introduced required a level of operational humility that had not traditionally existed in his environment, and Ava responded with calm acknowledgement that humility in this context was not weakness, but structural awareness of scale and impact. The silence that followed was no longer tense, but final in a different sense, as if all arguments had already been resolved not through agreement but through inevitability. Ava finally closed the folder that had been on the table since the beginning of the meeting, signaling that the formal discussion phase had reached its completion, and stated that the framework would now transition into implementation across designated divisions in accordance with the approved governance structure. William remained seated for a moment longer, not because he was resisting, but because he was understanding something that could not be reversed once fully acknowledged. He slowly raised his eyes to meet hers one last time, and in that moment he no longer saw a disruption to his authority, nor a challenge to his leadership, but the presence of a system that had already moved beyond the need for permission. And as Ava turned slightly toward the exit, William Carter understood that what had begun as a confrontation about a decision from 10 years ago had evolved into something far larger, where the past was no longer a memory he controlled, but a permanent structure within the future he was still required to operate inside.